She sat alone at the wedding until a millionaire whispered, "Pretend you're with me." The ballroom glittered with golden light as the string quartet played a soft waltz. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above the crowd of well-dressed guests, casting prismatic rainbows across the polished marble floors. Laughter echoed between marble pillars, mingling with the gentle clink of champagne glasses and the rustle of expensive fabric. At the center of it all, couples danced in perfect synchronization, families toasted to love and prosperity, and photographers rushed to capture every polished smile, every carefully orchestrated moment. Yet, at the far end of the room, tucked into the last row of tables near the service entrance, sat a young woman who did not belong. Her name was Clare Dawson, and she wore a simple navy dress, one she had borrowed from a friend who had taken pity on her situation. Her shoes pinched her feet because they were a size too small, the only pair she owned that could pass for formal wear. She had been invited only because her distant cousin had married into the wealthy Whitmore family, and Claire had nowhere else to go on that chilly autumn night. The invitation had felt like charity, but she had accepted it anyway, desperate for any distraction from her crumbling life. She sat quietly, hands wrapped around a glass of water, condensation dampening her fingertips. Her plate remained untouched despite the elaborate spread before her: roasted duck with cherry reduction, truffle-infused potatoes, and delicate pastries that looked too beautiful to eat. Waiters in crisp white jackets carried trays of champagne around her, their eyes sliding past as if she were invisible. Everywhere she looked, she saw luxury that felt like a different language. Gowns worth more than her annual rent swirled past in waves of silk and satin. Men in tailored tuxedos discussed business deals that involved more zeros than she could comprehend. Diamond jewelry glittered like ice around throats and wrists, catching the light with every gesture. It made her shrink further into her chair, pulling her borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had spent the last week searching desperately for work after being let go from the diner where she had waitressed for 3 years. The owner had apologized profusely, tears in his eyes, but the numbers didn't lie. Business was slow, and she was the newest hire. Her savings, never substantial to begin with, had almost vanished. Her landlord had already taped a warning notice to her apartment door in angry red letters, giving her 10 days to pay or face eviction. Her mother's medical bills sat in an unopened envelope on her kitchen counter because she couldn't bear to see numbers she had no way of paying. Sitting in this ballroom, surrounded by people who would never understand what it meant to choose between rent and food, felt like sitting inside a cruel joke. She wondered if anyone noticed her, the girl in the borrowed dress with shoes that didn't fit, pretending she belonged. Then, as she lowered her gaze to avoid another curious stare from a woman dripping in pearls, a shadow fell across her table. The air seemed to shift, carrying the subtle scent of expensive cologne, bergamot, and sandalwood. A tall man leaned close, his presence commanding without being aggressive. His tuxedo was perfectly cut, tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and a lean frame. His dark hair gleamed under the lights, swept back with casual elegance, and his eyes were an unusual shade of gray, like storm clouds before rain. His voice was low, smooth, and completely unexpected. "Pretend you're with me." Claire blinked in shock, her heart suddenly racing. She looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of mockery or cruel intent, but found only seriousness and something else she couldn't quite identify. Desperation, perhaps? Before she could answer, before she could process what was happening, he straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. A warm smile spread across his face as if they had always known each other, as if she were the most important person in the room. Guests turned their heads, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Whispers started immediately, traveling through the ballroom like ripples in water. Who is she? Where had she come from? How had she captured the attention of Alexander Reed? He slipped into the chair beside her with effortless confidence, his movements fluid and practiced. His hand came to rest lightly over hers on the table, warm and steady, and she felt the calluses on his palm, unexpected on someone so polished. "Follow my lead," he murmured, his lips barely moving, the words meant only for her. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Her voice came out as a whisper, trembling despite her attempt at composure. "Why me?" His eyes flicked toward the center of the ballroom, where an older woman stood surrounded by admirers. She wore a burgundy gown that probably cost more than Claire's annual salary, and her sharp eyes were fixed on them like a hawk watching prey. Her mouth was pressed into a thin line of displeasure, and even from this distance, Claire could feel the weight of her scrutiny. "Because if I show up alone," he said quietly, his tone carrying an edge of dark humor, "my aunt will not let me leave this night alive. Or at least, she'll make me wish I hadn't survived it. You just saved me from an evening of pointed questions about marriage prospects and thinly veiled threats about my inheritance." Claire almost laughed at the absurdity of it all, the idea that this man, clearly wealthy and powerful, needed saving from anything. But the seriousness in his gaze silenced her amusement. She looked down at his hand covering hers, strong and steady, and felt the weight of her own loneliness crash over her like a wave. For a brief second, she thought about what it would mean to play along, to pretend for just one night that she belonged in this world. What would it hurt? She wondered silently. As the music swelled, a new waltz beginning with violins that seemed to carry their own story, he rose and offered his hand. "Dance with me. Make it look real." Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the music and the chatter around them. Against every instinct that screamed this was dangerous, that she should run back to her corner and disappear into the shadows, Claire placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers with surprising gentleness, and she felt a jolt of electricity run up her arm. The room blurred around her as he led her onto the dance floor. His touch was firm but not controlling, guiding her with subtle pressure at her waist and the small of her back. His eyes never left hers, holding her captive with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. She had not danced in years, not since high school prom when her date had stepped on her feet and apologized profusely. But somehow, with this stranger, it felt easy. He moved with such confidence that her body simply followed, as though the two of them were the only people in the room, moving to music only they could truly hear. "Who are you really?" she asked in a hushed voice, barely audible over the strings and the whisper of fabric as they turned. He smiled faintly, a ghost of expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Tonight I'm your partner. That's all that matters." But Claire felt the weight of something unspoken in his words, layers of meaning she couldn't yet decipher. She didn't know yet that this stranger was far more than a charming man in a tuxedo. She didn't know that behind the mask of ease and confidence was one of the most powerful millionaires in the city, a man whose name appeared in business sections and society pages, whose decisions affected thousands of lives. And this dance, this lie they told together under the chandeliers, was the first step into a storm neither of them could escape. As the song ended and applause rippled through the ballroom, polite and rhythmic, the man tightened his grip gently on her hand. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, a small gesture that felt oddly intimate. "Stay with me," he whispered, his tone carrying both a plea and a command, vulnerability and authority wrapped together. And though every part of Claire wanted to flee back into the shadows, to return to her invisible corner and pretend this had never happened, she found herself nodding. Her voice was barely a breath. "Okay." At that moment, as the crowd pressed closer and curious eyes followed their every move, she could not have imagined how pretending to be his companion at one wedding would unravel into a contract that would bind them, a scandal that would threaten to destroy them, and a love story that would change her life forever. The music faded, and Claire stepped back from Alexander, her heart still hammering from the dance. The heat of his hand at her waist lingered like a brand. The stranger guided her toward the side of the ballroom, keeping his hand lightly at her back in a gesture that appeared both protective and possessive. Guests whispered as they passed, their eyes following the mysterious couple. Claire realized with growing anxiety that every eye in the room now believed they belonged together. It was dizzying, surreal, and strangely terrifying. He leaned close again, his breath warm against her ear. His voice remained calm but carried an undertone of urgency. "Stay beside me a little longer. It will help us both." Claire wanted to protest, to demand explanations, to understand what game they were playing. But then she saw the older woman who had been glaring across the room earlier. Her expression had softened now, satisfied by the sight of them together, though her eyes still held calculation. Claire suddenly understood with startling clarity that this man had needed her as much as she had needed someone, anyone, to notice her tonight. Minutes later, he guided her out through the carved oak doors into the quiet marble hallway. Away from the music and the crowd, his confidence faltered just enough to reveal a hint of weariness. The mask slipped, and she glimpsed something raw beneath. He extended his hand properly this time, formally, as if they were meeting for the first time in a more honest way. "I owe you an introduction. My name is Alexander Reed." The name struck her like a physical blow. She had heard it before, whispered in business news segments she caught while flipping channels, in gossip columns and magazines she sometimes read while waiting tables at the diner during slow shifts. Alexander Reed was the youngest heir of the Reed financial empire, a man written about with equal parts admiration and envy. But standing here in the dim hallway, with shadows playing across his face and exhaustion pulling at the corners of his eyes, he looked more human than legend. Claire hesitated before placing her hand in his again. "Clare Dawson," she answered softly, her voice steadier now. Alexander's eyes flicked down to her worn shoes, the leather scuffed and the heels slightly worn down on one side, then back up to her flushed face. There was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity and something that might have been recognition. "You were sitting alone. You looked honest. That's why I chose you." She almost laughed at the absurdity, but her throat tightened instead, emotions too complex to name swirling in her chest. "I'm no one important. Why pretend with me?" "Because," he said quietly, and for a moment his carefully constructed walls seemed to crumble entirely, "sometimes the people who are no one to society are the only ones worth trusting." For a moment, the words settled between them, heavier than the marble columns that surrounded them, more substantial than all the wealth displayed in the ballroom behind them. Claire wanted to walk away, to escape this dangerous new world that glittered with promises she couldn't trust. But she couldn't move. There was something magnetic about him, something that made her want to stay despite every logical reason to run. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared at her table, Alexander reached into his inner jacket pocket and drew out a folded document. The paper was expensive, heavy stock that whispered of lawyers and legal proceedings. He pressed it into her hand with surprising gentleness. "Read this when you're alone. It may sound outrageous, but I believe you'll understand." Confused and overwhelmed, Claire tucked the paper into her small clutch. Before she could question him, before she could demand to know what was happening, another guest approached from the ballroom. A man in his 50s with silver hair and a calculating smile called Alexander's name. Alexander gave her a final look, one that promised their story was only beginning, his gray eyes holding hers for a beat too long. Then he disappeared back into the glittering ballroom, swallowed by the crowd as if he had never been there at all. That night, long after the wedding had ended and the guests had dispersed into the autumn darkness, Claire sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment. The borrowed dress hung over the back of a chair like a ghost of the evening, and her two small shoes lay tossed aside near the door, forgotten. The single overhead light buzzed softly, casting harsh shadows across the cramped space. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the document. It was a contract. A marriage agreement. Her eyes widened as she scanned the precisely worded lines, reading and rereading passages that seemed impossible. Alexander Reed proposed a temporary marriage arrangement. The terms were laid out with businesslike clarity, each clause numbered and detailed. He would erase her debts completely, every credit card bill, every medical expense, every late rent payment. He would provide housing in his estate, a room of her own in luxury beyond imagination. He would ensure her mother's medical care, the best doctors, the necessary treatments, everything she had been desperately unable to afford. In return, she would accompany him to family gatherings and public events. She would play the role of his wife until his board of directors approved a pending merger that apparently required the appearance of stability and family values. No intimacy beyond what appearances demanded. No obligations past what the public needed to see. And a generous sum was deposited into her account each month, more money than she had ever imagined earning in a year. The contract specified a duration of 6 months with the possibility of extension by mutual agreement. At the end, she would receive a substantial settlement that would set her up comfortably for years. All she had to do was pretend. Claire's stomach twisted into knots. It was insane. It was humiliating. It reduced something sacred to a business transaction. And yet, it was everything she desperately needed. She thought of the eviction notice, the red letters that seemed to burn even when she closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's cough that had gotten worse over the winter, the medications they couldn't afford, the doctor's appointments she had canceled because the copay was impossible. Rent was 2 months overdue. Her job was gone. Her credit cards were maxed out. She had been skipping meals to save money, lying to her mother about eating at work. Her pride screamed to tear the paper apart, to throw it in the trash and forget this bizarre evening had ever happened. But her heart whispered of the hope this deal could bring. Hope for her mother. Hope for a future that didn't involve choosing between electricity and groceries. Hope for just a moment to breathe without drowning. As the city lights flickered through her window, illuminating the cracks in the ceiling and the peeling paint on the walls, Claire whispered to herself, "What have I gotten into?" She didn't know that this single choice, whether to sign or to walk away, would lead her into the greatest conflict of her life. The line between pretending and truly loving would blur until she couldn't see where one ended and the other began. Every truth she thought she knew about herself, about relationships, about what she deserved, would be tested in ways she couldn't imagine. For now, she folded the contract carefully and placed it beside her sketchbook, the worn notebook where she drew her dreams in pencil and charcoal. Her mind was too restless for sleep. Outside, the night deepened. Inside Clare Dawson's tiny apartment, a storm had already begun. Claire barely slept that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment while the words of the contract repeated in her mind like a mantra she couldn't silence. Marriage by arrangement. A life she could not imagine, tied to a man she had only just met. The numbers in the contract seemed fictional, amounts of money that couldn't possibly be real. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavily on her like a physical weight, but the thought of her mother's medicine and the eviction notice on her door pushed harder. When the morning light crept through the blinds, painting weak stripes across her floor, she made her decision. She would meet Alexander Reed again, if only to hear his explanation, to understand what kind of man would propose such an arrangement. That afternoon, she returned to the address listed at the bottom of the contract. The taxi ride itself felt unreal, like moving through a dream. The driver whistled low when he stopped at the tall iron gates of a sprawling estate on the edge of the city. The gates were wrought iron, decorated with intricate designs that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. They swung open silently, operated by invisible hands, to reveal a mansion that looked more like a museum from a different era. The estate stretched before her, impossibly vast. Tall white columns supported a facade that seemed to go on forever. Immaculate gardens stretched in every direction, manicured lawns interrupted by sculpted hedges and fountain displays. The driveway alone was longer than her street, lined with ancient oak trees that created a canopy of gold and crimson leaves. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational power, old money, the kind of privilege that shaped cities and decided futures. Inside, the reality was even more overwhelming. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors, polished to impossible perfection. Chandeliers lit every corridor, crystal droplets catching light and scattering it in rainbow patterns. Artwork lined the walls, not prints or reproductions, but originals she recognized from art history classes she had taken at community college. A housekeeper in a crisp uniform led her through hallways that seemed to multiply endlessly, each turn revealing more opulence. Finally, they arrived at a sunlit parlor where Alexander was waiting. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the gardens, and antique furniture arranged with careful precision created conversation areas. He stood by the window, his posture straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He wore casual clothes, expensive jeans and a white button-down shirt, but somehow he still looked formal, untouchable. When she entered, he turned. His eyes were steady on hers, assessing but not unkind. "You came," he said simply. "I had to," she admitted, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "I read the contract. Multiple times." It feels insane. Why would you want this? Why me, a complete stranger? Alexander walked closer, closing the distance between them with measured steps. His voice was low and deliberate when he spoke. Because I don't need a partner who plays games. I need someone who won't betray me. At the wedding, I saw how you looked at me. Not with calculation. Not with greed. Not sizing up my net worth or planning how to manipulate me. Just like a person seeing another person. That's rare in my world. Impossibly rare. Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks. So you want me to marry you? To pretend because I'm ordinary? Because you're honest, he corrected softly. And honesty is the one thing money cannot buy. Silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fear. Claire looked down at the contract, still clutched in her hand, the paper wrinkled from her nervous grip. Her pride rebelled against every word on those pages. But the image of her mother coughing in their small apartment, struggling to catch her breath, weighed heavily than pride ever could. Finally, she whispered, "What are the terms again? Explain it to me like I'm making the most important decision of my life. Because I think I am." Alexander's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm and businesslike. "This is a partnership. Appearances only. You will accompany me to 5 major events over the next 3 months. Board meetings, charity galas, family gatherings. You'll live here at the estate, so the arrangement appears convincing. Separate wing, your own space, complete privacy." He paused, making sure she understood each point. "I will settle your debts immediately. All of them. Your credit will be restored. I'll secure proper medical care for your mother at the best facilities in the city, specialists who can actually help her. And I'll ensure your financial stability both during and after our arrangement." Claire's hands shook as she processed the words. "There will be boundaries," he continued. "No intimacy. No invasion of private life beyond what the public sees. We sign, we fulfill the terms, and we both get what we need. At the end, you walk away with enough money to start whatever life you want." Claire's hands shook as she set the paper on the polished table. She looked him directly in the eye, searching for deception or hidden cruelty. "And if I refuse?" "Then you walk out that door," Alexander said evenly, gesturing toward the parlor entrance. "And I won't stop you. But you return to your world as it is now. Debts that keep growing. Eviction that's coming whether you're ready or not. Unanswered phone calls from doctors while your mother gets sicker. I'm offering you a chance to breathe, Claire. Nothing more, nothing less." Her chest tightened. It felt like a trap wrapped in kindness, yet also like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. She picked up the pen lying on the table. It was heavy, probably gold, worth more than she wanted to know. Her hand hovered over the signature line, trembling. Then, with a deep breath that felt like jumping off a cliff, she signed her name. The ink was dark against the pale paper, permanent and damning and hopeful all at once. When the ink dried, Alexander reached for the document. His expression was unreadable, carefully neutral. He extended his hand to her once more, but this time it wasn't just for introduction or a dance. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Reed." The words made her stomach twist. She wasn't his wife in any real sense, yet the weight of that title settled heavily on her shoulders like an invisible crown she hadn't earned. Later that evening, she stood at the tall windows of the guest suite assigned to her. The room was more luxurious than anything she had ever known, like something from a movie. Silk curtains in dove gray framed windows that stretched floor to ceiling. A bed large enough for 3 people dominated the space, covered in linens that felt like clouds. Antique furniture pieces that probably belonged in museums. And a view of gardens glowing under moonlight, paths lit by small lanterns that created rivers of light through the darkness. But despite the beauty surrounding her, Claire felt small and out of place, like a borrowed piece in someone else's elaborate chess game. From the hallway came the muffled sound of footsteps, Alexander returning to his own wing of the massive house. She glanced at the closed door, her heart skipping. This house, this contract, this new identity, it was all too much. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the cool surface against her palm. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. Downstairs, Alexander Reed poured a glass of scotch and stared out at the same moonlit gardens from his study. His face, composed as ever, betrayed only a flicker of thought. He had made business deals worth millions, negotiated with ruthless competitors, and built his empire through calculated risk. But never one that unsettled him quite like this. Both of them knew the contract was only the beginning. Neither could see yet how quickly pretending would blur into something real, something dangerous, and something that would change them forever. The game had begun, and neither of them knew the rules. What happens next in Clare and Alexander's story? Will the boundaries they've set hold, or will their arranged marriage become something neither of them planned for? Comment below with your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to part 2 of this dramatic love story.